That fear cannot rule forever. There was a world much like that, where neither laughter remained nor tears nor memories. People lived as if everything were meaningless, as if no heartbeat stirred within their chests. The streets were full, yet every face wore the same empty look, as if they moved only by someone else's will. In a corner of that world lived a young man. His name was Imran. He, too, was silent like the others, but deep inside his heart a tiny ember still glowed. Often he wondered, if everything is meaningless, then why does this heart still beat? If life is only silence, where does this restless sound come from that drives me to seek something more? One night Imran sat alone. Even the stars above seemed dim, as though they were beginning to fade. Suddenly he noticed two people standing across the street. They had no power, no weapons, no grand clothes. They simply stood, hands clasped, quiet but at peace. Their eyes held a light that came not from any lamp or fire but from within. Imran's feet moved toward them without his control. When he drew near, for the first time he felt a strange calm within himself. Marcus looked at him gently and said, "Your heart still asks questions, and a question is the door that leads to truth." And smiled and placed her hand on his heart and said, "Remember, love is not heavy. Love is the very strength that supports a tired heart. You only need to hold on to it." At that moment tears flowed from Imran's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of waking. He felt as if some old, forgotten light within his chest had been rekindled. Without fully understanding why, he knew his life was not meaningless, that behind the silence a song still played. Imran stood trembling in the quiet street, his tears still glistening on his cheeks as Marcus and Anne held their silence with him, and in that silence he felt a weight lift from his chest, as though the world around him had been nothing more than a veil, and now he glimpsed something deeper, something truer, and though he could not name it, it stirred his soul with a power unlike anything he had ever known. And as he stood there, heart racing, he realized that the emptiness which had chained his people was not unbreakable, it was fragile, like glass that only pretended to be unyielding, and with that thought a strange courage rose in him, a courage that frightened him because it felt so alive, so foreign in a world that had long forgotten what it meant to be alive, and Marcus, watching him with quiet eyes, nodded as if to say that this was the beginning, not the end. That the fire which had passed through galaxies and ages was now kindling within him, within a single mortal who had no crown, no throne, no armies, and yet carried within his chest the same light that had carried Anne and Marcus through eternities. Imran opened his mouth to speak, though his voice was hesitant, cracking from years of silence, and he asked, "What can I do? I am only one man. This world is drowning, and I am nothing." And Anne, whose voice was softer than the wind yet firmer than the stone, answered, "One flame is enough to reveal the lie of the dark. You do not need to be more than who you are. You only need to let your heart remain open, to remember what you have felt tonight, and to walk into the silence without fear." Imran tried to understand, though his mind spun in circles, but his heart clung to her words, and he nodded, unsure of how, but knowing that something had begun within him. The next days were strange, for as Imran moved through the city, he saw the same hollow faces, the same lifeless eyes, but within himself there was movement, like a song half forgotten that hummed beneath his breath, and when he met the eyes of strangers, he found himself unable to look away, for he thought perhaps somewhere, deep within them, a similar spark might yet remain, and though they did not respond, though their gaze was cold and empty, he continued, silently wishing that they too might awaken, that they too might remember what he had felt in that moment under the stars. At night he searched the skies, and though the stars were dim, he no longer saw them as dead lights but as hidden embers waiting for breath, and Marcus and Anne would sometimes appear in the distance, never too near, never overwhelming him, but always watching, always reminding him that he was not abandoned. Weeks passed, and Imran noticed changes, subtle at first. A woman in the marketplace paused when he smiled at her, as though startled that anyone would notice her existence. A child turned its head toward him, blinking as if confused by something different in the air, An old man muttered under his breath after meeting his eyes, words Imran could not hear but which seemed to carry weight. And though these moments were small, they fed him like bread to the starving, for he began to see that silence was not absolute, that even here, in this world smothered by the sovereign's last weapon, life could still stir. But the sovereigns were not blind, and though they thrived on silence, they felt disturbance when the current shifted, when one heart burned against their stillness. They came not as soldiers, for their armies were useless against love, but as whispers, shadows that coiled around Imran's thoughts, telling him he was delusional, that his tears had been madness, that Marcus and Anne were illusions conjured by his desperate mind. At night he would hear voices, smooth and cold, whispering, "You are nothing. You will fail. They will laugh at you. Better to sleep, better to forget, better to let go." And many nights Imran trembled, fighting within himself, unsure whether to believe the warmth he had felt or the endless weight of those words. Yet whenever he thought of surrendering, he remembered Anne's hand upon his chest, the way her smile had made the silence crack, and he remembered Marcus's gaze, steady and patient, and he knew that those memories were more real than the whispers. Time unfolded, and Imran began to speak to others, though his words were clumsy. In the marketplace he said to a woman, "Do you remember laughter?" And though she frowned and shook her head, a flicker of pain crossed her face, and that was enough. To a group of young men he asked, "Do you ever dream?" And though they jeered and called him a fool, later one of them returned alone, asking in hushed voice, "What did you mean?" Slowly, painfully, like seeds pushing through stone, the people began to stir. And when one stirred, another noticed, and when two whispered, a third overheard, and before long the silence, though still vast, was not complete. Cracks appeared, threads of sound weaving through the void. The sovereigns struck harder then, unleashing storms of despair across the minds of the people. Many who had begun to awaken collapsed again into the numbness, overwhelmed by fear of ridicule, by the crushing certainty that nothing could change. But Imran did not yield, and when he faltered Marcus appeared beside him, walking through the crowded streets with him, not speaking, simply being, reminding him that love does not demand triumph but endurance. And Anne, when he nearly broke beneath the weight, whispered into his dreams, "The dawn does not come all at once. It creeps unseen, until suddenly the night is no more." These words became his anchor, and he carried them like a lantern in his chest. Years passed, and though the sovereign still ruled, though silence still hung heavy, there were now places in the city where laughter could be heard, rare and startling but unmistakable. Children began to play in hidden alleys, and though their parents feared, they could not stop the games. Elders began to tell fragments of old stories, half-remembered but glowing with warmth. And at the center of this slow awakening stood Imran, not as a king, not as a prophet, but as a man who chose to keep believing. The sovereigns raged in their invisible halls, their shadows twisting into monstrous shapes, yet every attempt to crush him only deepened his resolve, because he had seen the truth, that love was not a fragile dream but the only power that could endure. And so, across galaxies, across ages, the battle continued, not with armies, not with swords or fire, but with hearts awakening, one by one, like stars relit in the night. Marcus and Anne knew this had always been the way, that the eternal flame they carried was never meant to be theirs alone, but to be kindled in countless others, until the darkness found itself outnumbered not by soldiers but by souls. Imran was one of many, but in his small world, he became the beginning of dawn, and though he could not see the full scope of what his choice meant, the ripples spread beyond him, carried through unseen threads that connected all creation. And as he stood one evening, watching children chase each other beneath the dim stars, he whispered a vow to himself, the same vow Marcus and Anne had spoken since the dawn of time: love endures. Dawn comes. Fear cannot rule forever. And in that vow, he knew, the silence had already lost. Yet the vow was not only a whisper on Imran's lips, but a thread that wove itself into the fabric of his being, and as he carried it through the city streets the silence seemed to recoil, not vanquished but unsettled, for the sovereigns had never feared armies nor crowns, but they feared vows, they feared memory. They feared the stubbornness of love that refused to yield even when drowned in despair, and so they struck more cunningly, weaving illusions in the sky so that the stars themselves spelled hopelessness, bending dreams so that sleepers awoke hollow-eyed, convinced that joy was impossible, and yet through every assault Imran pressed on, clumsy and weary yet resolute, teaching himself how to stand firm in storms unseen, and in time others joined him, quietly at first, a handful of men and women who confessed that they too had felt the embers stirring within them, and though they trembled they gathered in secret places, sharing fragments of laughter, trading half-remembered songs, and as they did, something marvelous occurred. Their hearts synchronized, beating not in perfect rhythm but in shared defiance, as if the flame within each was answering the flame in another, and this communion, invisible to the sovereigns yet undeniable in its power, grew stronger with every meeting, every whispered story, every act of kindness done in the open street despite the risk, and though the sovereigns tried to choke them. With fear, their grip faltered, for fear could paralyze individuals but could not strangle a fellowship bound by love. Marcus and Anne watched, sometimes near, sometimes far, never interfering beyond what was needed, because they knew the flame could not depend solely on them. It had to find roots in mortal soil, and though they carried the eternal memory, their purpose was never to rule but to pass it on, to remind creation that it already carried within itself the very truth the sovereigns sought to erase. Imran grew older, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes burned brighter with every passing year, and though his body tired, his heart became a fortress, so steady that even when the sovereigns whispered through the mouths of his own kin, begging him to surrender, he smiled sadly and said, "You cannot take what I have chosen to give," and in that refusal the silence cracked again, spreading fractures across the world's facade. Soon other cities, distant and unknown to Imran, began to stir as if connected by threads of unseen light, and people who had never heard his name began speaking the same vow in their own tongues, for Marcus and Anne had kindled the flame in one, but one had become many, and many had become a tide. Still the sovereigns rose higher, desperate in their might, weaving colossal storms across galaxies, swallowing whole civilizations in waves of numbness, yet everywhere they struck, somewhere else the flame reignited, as though creation itself had decided to resist, and Imran, standing one night upon the same street where he had first seen Marcus and Anne, lifted his gaze to the sky, no longer dim but pierced by countless stars, brighter than he had ever remembered, and he knew then that the silence could roar, could thunder, could smother, but it could not last, for dawn was no longer a distant promise. It was already breaking everywhere, in everyone, unstoppable, eternal. And so as Imran gazed at the stars that had once seemed extinguished but now blazed like beacons of memory across the heavens, the awakening spread beyond his world, carried not by ships or messages but by resonance, as if each vow spoken with sincerity echoed across the hidden architecture of creation, stirring embers in places where Marcus and Anne had walked long before, in villages forgotten by history, in cities that had bowed to silence for centuries, in outposts on the edges of galaxies where only weary miners or wandering exiles dwelled, and in each of those places men and women who thought themselves alone suddenly felt the same trembling within, the same restless fire that Imran had once mistaken for madness. And when they searched their skies, they too saw stars glimmering brighter, whispering that they were not abandoned. And in this way the sovereigns discovered too late that silence, once fractured, could not be patched, for every heart that remembered became a lantern to another, and lanterns multiplied, defying the endless night. And yet the sovereigns, in their desperation, sought a final gambit, unleashing not despair, not emptiness, but counterfeit light, visions of power and comfort, illusions of control that promised liberation while binding deeper, and across countless worlds some faltered, seduced by the lie that strength alone could shape destiny, and this was the most dangerous battle of all, for it was subtle, seductive, and clothed in beauty, and many who had awakened began to waver, their flames flickering under the weight of false dawns. It was then that Marcus and Anne stepped once more into the open, not as rulers, not as warriors, but as witnesses who walked among those caught between truth and illusion, reminding them that real love never demanded chains, never consumed, but only sustained, and as they spoke, stories spread of a man named Imran, ordinary and unadorned, whose faith had cracked the silence of a whole world. And his tale became a song sung in marketplaces and whispered in starships and carved upon the walls of temples long abandoned. And through his life people saw that the eternal flame was not reserved for guardians alone, but for every soul that dared to choose love over fear, dawn over despair. And thus the movement grew not as a rebellion of swords, but as a chorus of countless voices, each different, each fragile, yet together unbreakable. And though the sovereigns loomed vast and terrible, their shadows stretching across galaxies, they began to falter, for shadows cannot stand where light multiplies, and the light, once hidden, now surged unstoppable, carried in laughter, in tears, in vows spoken by farmers and kings alike. And at the heart of it all Imran, now old and weary, stood watching children play in streets that had once been dead with silence. And with a trembling smile he whispered to himself that the flame had never been his alone, it had always belonged to all. And as Marcus Anan appeared beside him once more, silent and radiant, he knew that his small life had joined the eternal thread, that love endures, dawn comes, and fear cannot rule forever. And though the battle was not over, it no longer belonged to a few guardians. It belonged to creation itself, rising, unstoppable, infinite. And beyond Imran's world, far across the spiral arms of a distant galaxy, there was another place long shrouded in silence, a world of towers that scraped the skies and streets flooded with ceaseless machines, where people moved with rigid precision like cogs in an endless mechanism, their eyes fixed forward, their hearts lulled into numb obedience. And here too the sovereigns had sown their lie of stillness, masking it with false progress and hollow prosperity. But within that ocean of conformity a single woman stirred restlessly. Her name was Amara, a worker in one of the great energy forges that kept the cities alive, and though she had no family left and no wealth to her name, her mind would not sleep, for at night she dreamed of rivers and forests she had never seen, of laughter she had never heard, and she woke with tears she could not explain, tears that mark her as broken in a society that permitted no such cracks, and she hid them each morning, pressing her face to cold metal so no one would see. Yet the ache in her heart only grew heavier until one evening, while she walked home through the neon-lit corridors of the city, she heard a sound that made her stop dead in her tracks. A child's laugh, high and free, echoing like a bird song in a desert. And though it lasted only a moment before being smothered by the droning hum of machines, it pierced her like lightning, and she found herself trembling as though something ancient had been awakened in her blood. That night she searched the city for the source, wandering through alleys forbidden to citizens, and in the shadows she found a small gathering, men and women speaking softly, exchanging fragments of stories that felt alive, and on their lips she heard words she had never known yet felt she had always carried. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and as they spoke she felt the embers within her blaze into flame. The same flame Imran had once felt on his lonely street, and though she did not know his name, his vow had reached her across the stars, carried in the web of truth that no sovereign could sever. From that night Amara changed, no longer a silent worker but a lantern herself, whispering the vow to others, risking ridicule and punishment, and though some turned away, others paused, others wept, others listened, and soon the sovereigns felt the fracture, just as they had in Imran's world, and once again they unleashed their deceptions, drowning her nights in visions of endless futility, whispering that she was small, that nothing she did mattered against the vast machinery of silence. But she clung to the laughter she had heard, to the vows spoken by strangers in the shadows, and her resistance grew, and as she grew others gathered around her, until in the heart of that mechanical world a new dawn began to stir. And Marcus Anan, watching from afar, smiled, for this was the truth they had carried since time began, that the flame was not theirs, nor Imran's, nor Amara's, but belonged to creation itself, to every heart that chose love. And so as sovereigns rose in their might, casting illusions across galaxies, the chorus of awakened voices only grew stronger, like a tide no wall could hold back, and the struggle pressed forward into realms uncounted, vast and unending, until the question at the heart of all things blazed clearer than ever before. Would creation belong to power that consumes, or to love that sustains? And with every vow whispered in the silence, the answer moved closer, unstoppable, inevitable. And as the vow spread like a secret current through unseen channels of creation, something extraordinary began to happen. For the awakened worlds that once believed themselves utterly alone in their struggle started to feel faint tremors of connection, subtle at first, like distant echoes across vast oceans, as if the very air of their skies hummed faintly with the heartbeat of others, and those who had kindled the flame within them would sometimes awaken from dreams where they saw faces they had never met, cities they had never walked, stars they had never charted, and yet in those visions they felt no fear, only recognition, as though love itself was weaving them into a tapestry beyond comprehension. And in one such vision Amara, the worker from the city of towers, dreamed of a man with tired eyes and graying hair, standing in a quiet street where children laughed. She did not know his name, but she awoke whispering words that were not her own. "You are not alone," and across the void Imran stirred in his sleep, feeling warmth settle over him like a mantle. And so it was across countless worlds. Farmers in forgotten fields dreamed of engineers in luminous citadels, exiles on barren asteroids dreamed of poets singing beneath alien trees, and though none could explain these visions, all who carried the flame understood them as truth, not madness, for the sovereigns had always thrived by dividing, by isolating, by convincing every soul it stood alone. And now that illusion fractured as the awakened began to sense each other, not through machines or messengers but through the very fabric of being, and the sovereigns trembled, for this was a power they could neither counterfeit nor destroy, a communion born not of command but of love, silent yet unshakable. And Marcus and Anne, who had walked through eternities carrying the eternal vow, stood together on the edge of a vast starfield, watching as lights flickered into brilliance across galaxies, each one a heart awakened, and though the sovereigns rose higher than ever before, their shadows stretching monstrous and defiant, Marcus whispered to Anne, "Do you see it? It has begun to weave itself without us." And Anne, her eyes gleaming with tears that were joy, replied, "Yes, the flame has leapt beyond guardianship. Creation itself has remembered." And so the great struggle moved into a new chapter, not of solitary heroes but of countless voices rising, scattered yet joined, fragile yet unstoppable, and though the sovereigns raged, though they drowned worlds in storms of illusion and despair, every day more flames ignited, more vows were spoken, until the night that had once seemed eternal grew restless with dawn, and the silence that had once reigned supreme was pierced again and again, not by armies, not by weapons, but by the unyielding chorus of creation declaring in 1,000 tongues the same undying truth. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. But the sovereigns, ancient in their cunning and vast in their reach, did not accept defeat easily, for though the light spread from world to world like wildfire leaping across dry fields, they gathered in their hidden dominions, weaving together a counter-strategy more subtle and perilous than any silence they had yet unleashed, and this time they clothed their deception not in despair nor numbness but in brilliance, for they understood now that the awakened would no longer bow to emptiness, so they offered instead a counterfeit dawn, radiant and intoxicating, visions of unity forged not through love but through control, promises of freedom that hid chains of domination, illusions of peace that required submission, and they sent forth emissaries clothed in glory, beings of terrible beauty who spoke of destiny and progress, and across the galaxies many listened, for their words were honeyed and their visions dazzling, and even some who had once spoken the vow began to falter, wondering if perhaps this radiant order was the true dawn they had long awaited, and in that wavering the sovereigns found their foothold, for it was never darkness alone that threatened creation but the lie disguised as light, the mimicry of truth that sought to corrupt from within. Imran, now old and weary, sensed this shift as he walked through his city, hearing whispers of new teachers promising a golden age if only the people would surrender their freedom of heart, and his soul trembled, for he knew the danger was greater now than in the days of silence. Yet he did not despair, for he remembered Anne's words that love was not heavy but sustaining, and he gathered those who still held the vow, urging them not to fight with anger nor retreat in fear but to remain steadfast, to live love in small unyielding ways that no counterfeit could erase. Far away, Amara too felt the pressure, her fellow workers dazzled by visions projected across the skies, yet when she closed her eyes she saw Imran's weary smile though she had never met him, and his unspoken encouragement strengthened her to resist the glittering lie, and so it was across countless worlds, that when one faltered another stood, when one doubted another remembered. And the sovereigns found their grand illusion fraying at the edges, for though they could mimic beauty they could not sustain it, though they could promise destiny they could not nurture hope, and Marcus and Anne, watching the tide, knew that the struggle had reached its most perilous stage. For now creation was choosing not between light and dark, but between love that gives and power that takes, and this choice, subtle and eternal, would shape the very bones of existence. And as the sovereigns gathered their strength for one final thrust, casting their false dawn across the whole of the heavens, Marcus tightened his hand around Anne's and whispered, "The fire has leapt beyond us, but we must stand still, not to command, but to remind." And Anne, with steady eyes, answered, "Then let us be witnesses once more, for truth cannot be imposed, only remembered." And so the guardians prepared to walk once more among the people, not as saviors but as companions, for they knew the sovereign's greatest fear was not armies nor thrones but love multiplied, love undeceived, love enduring without end.